Welcome to my paint-along video of Stanley Lake in Idaho. This is a fun little watercolor sketch to give you an intro to the wonders of watercolor. The first thing I'm doing is just painting water on the sky, just plain old water, and then just with the shape of the clouds, go around the clouds with that cerulean blue while it's still wet, and just let that blend into the clouds. But it blends a lot, so just use a little bit of paint. Let it blend in a little bit. The next thing I'm doing is looking for any warm areas on the mountains and dropping in some burnt sienna and yellow ochre with a lot of water, not a lot of pigment here, just almost just a suggestion, just to give it some warmth on that mountain where the sun is shining in that direction. Same thing with the trees in the foreground, be in front of the mountains anyway. It's still kind of the background. It's hard to add warmth later, so I start with the warm colors, those light warm colors, because if you try to get it later, it turns kind of muddy. Now adding a little bit of the pinks and blues and letting those all blend in together. It's a wet into wet approach. There's so much color in these mountains, and I want to bring out the colors. A little bit of cerulean blue with the pinks mixed into that, little burnt sienna. There's some grays that you mix with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And then add pinks and blues to that. Let that just blend in. It's the fun part of watercolor, is allowing these colors to fuse together. No other medium does that. Now I want you to look at this closely and see where the lights and darks are. And lay in where the darks are going. This is a process of blues and burnt sienna, but it is pretty vague at this point. You will add more pigment on top of that as a glazing process as it dries. But the first layer is quite light. Still lots of water with it, because you can add layer after layer. Sometimes I will have up to 3 to even 8 layers, depending on how much contrast and detail I want. Now this painting is really about the mountains. The lake in front of the mountains are helping tell about the mountains, even though they are in the foreground, and that's usually what we paint more of. In this case, it's more about the mountains. And so I'm putting more detail in the mountains because that is the subject matter, even though it's further in the background. Even those trees that I'm just laying in right there in their sap green, they're coming forward and they're in front of the trees, in front of the mountains, but they're subtle, very, very subtle. It's really more about those mountain peaks. And so, but those dark trees help make the mountains stand out. So it definitely has its job to do. So as I'm laying in this sap green and ultramarine blue, I'm just letting that fuse together and leaving a few holes there. While I'm doing the trees, I'm using some yellow ochre on the left side to show that that's where the light's coming from, those warm colors. And so this is just like dropping little pieces. I'm not just filling in a whole shape of a tree. I'm just dropping in little pieces of color when I'm doing a tree. The top of a tree, let the point of your brush do the work. You want that to be a real fine end of the tree, not thick. So while this is drawing in the peaks of this mountain, coming back and putting a little bit more detail while some of the others are drawing, going around those trees, not going over the yellow. That yellow is pretty important on those trees, so just go right around that, the yellow that I laid in before. I'm leaving some little spaces, some holes in those trees coming off of the mountain, just for some sparkle. You can always go over it later. While that's drying, you're going to come down and do the grass. It's just the base of those trees. And be careful to leave a little slice of sand underneath it. Just laying in some greens in those trees. Being really careful not to let that blend into the trees in the background, the trees far away. You want those to come forward. So blend some darks, blues and greens, and let that fuse into the green that you have from that sap green, green underneath. I'm dropping in some burnt sienna just to give some warmth in those trees, to bring those forward just a little bit. And now, going back to the trees and going around that yellow ochre, not going over it, but kind of to the side of it and around it, leaving some holes in the trees. It's not just one shape of a tree, it's just find the shapes inside the tree, not on that outside. Just drop in interesting shapes to make the tree. It takes a little bit of practice to get trees right. They're fun to do. Okay, a little bit more detail on the trees again. I usually go back over trees 2 or 3 times at least. As the paint dries, it gets lighter in value. You put it down there dark while it's wet, you think, wow, I've got this dark, great tree. And then a few minutes later, it gets lighter and lighter. But that's okay, because the glazing process allows you to go back over it and give some more depth. And it actually gives it more interest. It's not just one block of solid, uninteresting color. That's the fun thing about watercolor, are these layers that you can put in keeping it translucent. A little bit more detail at the base of those bushy trees down there. And I want those to stand out, so now I'm going around the tops of the trees into those background trees. Keeping those lines horizontal, somewhat horizontal, because those trees are far away. You're not painting all the individual trees in that background. These are far away. Okay, now the water. Lots of people are afraid of water, but it's really about just the reflection of the mirror of the mountains and the trees. Just lay that in very wet. Not a lot of pigment at this point. Leaving that little slice of sandbar between the lake and those trees. That's actually pretty important right there. Now I'm just dropping in some of those reflected colors that I see to help that create the story, if you will, of the reflection of those mountain peaks. It really helps if you indicate the poles of the trees. You don't want to overdo this. Less is more when it comes to water. As you look at it, say to yourself, does this look like a reflection? And if it does, then that's when you stop. While that's drying, I go into a little bit more detail, but not much. A little bit of warmth for that sandbar right there, but not much. You almost leave it white. And even though I don't always see this in the picture, I always do a few horizontal lines in the water just to say this is water. A little bit of contrast to make that sandbar stand out. So I'm doing some wet into wet with those greens right up against the sandbar. That actually helps it look more like water as well.